Hey folks, so welcome to our first reading from the Q. Okay, so this is by far the largest chunk that you'll have to read in our course. It's the first 100 pages of our text. That's for a lot of reasons. If you've gotten to the end already, you see that this is a good chopping point before there's going to be a lot more rising action that is set up. Another reason is just so we can get a lot of characters on the table and a sense of setting and the shape of the plot, enough to kind of discuss and have enough to analyze and get your reactions going, how your impressions and analysis of how the Q itself is developing and what are the characters like that we're going to be dealing with. Okay. Also, I want us to read a big chunk at the beginning to get a sense of what our author is doing. What is our world? Okay. There's a really big difference between this text and the next text that we're going to be reading in the sense of the writing. So our narrative so far have given us the tools of thinking about what the author is actively doing in presenting material in particular ways, what the historical context of the narrative is, and then thinking about the themes and symbols that might be going on, right? So in these first three sections, it's not accidental how they each begin, right? So we meet our two main characters in this first vignette of the text, right? So how do we meet Yaya? Well, at the Q, he's the first one we interact with, right? We meet him in pain, standing at the Q, trying not to interact with those around him, right? He's not very interested in sharing what's going on with him. He's a little threatened and vulnerable. The more people understand what's going on with him and what he's seeking at the gate. But we don't meet him in person, actually. The first introduction we have with him is through the document at the beginning. So he's the first character that we're introduced to, but not personally. It's through this document that section 1 begins with, right? So we meet Yaya through a document, and then Tarak, our arguably second most central character, as someone who's reading this document. So I want us to think about this structure for our text. We've read 3 chapters, and that gives us 3 sections, and that gives us a really nice sense of how these sections develop, okay? So at the beginning of each section, we have a vignette or a picture of Tarak interacting with Yaya's file. Each of our sections will begin this way. And time is passing, right? We get the sense that Tarak is looking at these documents roughly, perhaps, this is something to maybe be critical of, as time is passing at the Q. That's a little bit how it seems to me, at least as a reader right now, right? So we get Tarak interacting with the document as our novel opens. We read about Yaya coming into the hospital, and we get a bit of a character summary of Tarak, right? He is working to the letter of his profession. He lives up to his obligations. The nurses know very little about him outside his job, and he's frustrated at his relationship with this patient, right? He wishes that he didn't have the relationship with Yaya as a doctor-patient, right? So that's the first section, view that we get of Tarak interacting with the document. In section 2, the Tarak document interaction, there's more information in the file, right, that we're exposed to. And we see more frustration with Tarak, where he wishes that this wasn't the case. He's feeling fraught. But think about the way in which he's fraught. Is it the way that we would expect? Is it a way that we would relate to, have sympathy with? How would you characterize this person, the subject of a text? Would it be sympathetic? Would it be of a hero? Right? What is bothering him about having this document of a patient in his life, of having this relationship back on this disgraceful events? on the day of the disgraceful events, right? Relatedly, as a side note, in this section, we hear about the disgraceful events from 3 different characters, from 3 different sources. We never get an objective, just like tag in history, here's what the disgraceful events were. But we get it from multiple different perspectives, and that can reveal something about the character who is reflecting on the disgraceful events. And we can kind of maybe put them together to get what the author is trying to portray they were like, but I think that's more revealing about what the character is. So how does Tarek think about the disgraceful events? I think it is decidedly different than what our other characters think about the disgraceful events, but that's a side note to think about. The second section, opening with Tarek looking at the information in the documents, we're getting more information, and he's thinking more about his relationship to Yaya and the gate, the authority, right? So we learn more about the authority, and he draws in a frustrating way where he feels disconnected, right? And then he erases it, right? So he's again dissociating himself from the case, from Yaya's pain, from Yaya's medical reality. He wants to not be associated with it. And then the final in section 3, think again, I'm just giving a brief thing, but the final thing, there's pages missing, right? So it's a kind of interesting connection from section 2 where he dissociates and erases a drawing. Now the gate has erased information. And what is Tarek's reaction to the missing pages? It's a bit of relief. Someone is taking this burden away from him. He's not going to get in trouble, and he's not going to have a decision to make, right? So think about Tarek. What role is he playing in the story, right? He's beginning every section. Why might that be? How is he developing just over these 3 sections? Is he growing? Is he changing? Not necessarily positive, negative, but is he changing? Are we just learning more about him? How would you characterize this person in our book? Okay, so that's a shaping idea. The other thing to think about as something that's progressing through these 3 sections is the cue itself, right? So we learn very little of it in the beginning, where Yaya just doesn't want to share information about himself, and we kind of learn why. Like, he has an illegal bullet in him, right? And that information, we learn about how safe or dangerous, or how his reality is relating to how society accepts or rejects his reality over the course of this text. But you can think about the cue, and I really encourage you to track this, how much it kind of becomes a society of its own. And here's what I mean by that. When Yaya leaves and comes back, there are rules regarding that, right? He doesn't tell somebody that he's leaving. This is a long line, and they're all very invested in why they're there, right? We learn about why everybody's in the queue at the very beginning. Well, the people around Yaya, at least. So he's kind of being weird by not sharing his information. Like, why is he there with other people? But think about how many kind of just norms and rules and how everybody understands each other. So not like explicit ones, but they're just normal ways of being now by the end of 3 about being in the queue. And there's kind of more of a distinction about being in the queue and being in the rest of the city, right? So kind of try to track how you were feeling about the queue as maybe a entity of its own. One of the ways that a lot of people go to this book and analyze this book, a lot of papers have been just written about this, thinking about the queue as its own character that has character development throughout. Okay, so those are 2 ways of kind of coming to these first 3 sections. Thinking about the format, the shape of it, typically with Tarek and these documents. So Tarek as a link maybe to the gate, so an intermediary, thinking about the dissociation, thinking about where guilt and blame might be, this dissociation between bureaucracy and someone who's in pain, right? The other one is, what do we do with the Q, the development of new societies, what the role of government plays with that, how humans might just develop this on their own. The third thing I'd like to highlight is that we now have our cast of characters, right? Who is being represented here? One of the interesting things that I like about this book is we've got a variety. One of the things that the Q does, the literal Q, is because everyone needs documentation from the government in order to get anything done. Otherwise, they are out of the system, right? You can't get a job, you can't get food. If you are deemed outside, if you're deemed without the proper documentation, that can happen to anyone, right? So we have a variety of socioeconomic classes. We have a different variety of people who had good standing with the government, right? We've got people from military families. We've got people who were working for the government, right? And we've got a rich cast of characters that are more or less confident when they're coming to the Q, right? So we've got the man in the Galabeah. We've got Shalaby. We've got Uma Brooke. We've got Inez, right? These are going to be important people. They're not going to go away. They are people who grow and have to navigate the society of the Q over time. So even in these three sections, Inez has changed in how she's navigating. She was shocked by herself because she's trying to navigate this Q and she's not really recognizing herself. So she was a teacher. Having to be a teacher, you navigate spaces, right? You're good at recognizing how a group is and working with it, right? A classroom has a lot of different personalities. The lot of personalities in the Q, Inez didn't do well, right? So she is navigating a completely new space, and at the beginning, not super well. Uma Brooke hasn't navigated society very well. How is she doing in the Q, right? So thinking about that, tracking how Shalaby and the man in the Galabeah work with power structures here. Shalaby's used to being on top, right? He's bragging about his brother. He's in a new situation where he thinks he's going to dominate. How does that go, right? So these are lenses through which we can see the development of the Q. And so because these characters aren't flat, because we recognize the tensions and the personalities that they have, we can use it as a lens to see the Q and to see their relationships with the government. So the third way I invite us to have an in through these first three chapters to develop is to recognize that we have robust characters, not flat characters. So you could use any one of them in the way that I just described, what we know about them before the Q, and then how they have to navigate this new reality of the power structures of the Q. Okay? So those are the three ways that I invite you to consider these first three sections. The reason we stopped at the end is because every other section, which is going to be maybe less than a third of what you've just read, those chunks are action-packed, and we need to stop at the end of them in order to kind of come back together, discuss what you think will happen next, how you process what happened there. But here's a lot of stage setting. You get enough going on so you have a sense of the novel. Okay, and we'll talk next week about how important it was to have this first 100 chapters. Ooh, 100 pages. Okay, so hopefully this was a helpful frame. You have your discussion questions, just like we've been doing. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Have a great week. Bye.